have the distinct honor of introducing our speaker today for our keynote this morning. And I would like a show of hands of how many people get paid on their daily basis to write Ruby code. Pretty neat. How many people, raise your hands, if you got paid on a daily basis to write Ruby code in 2001? Dave, yeah. In 2002, I think Dave and I and a couple of others, right? So Jim. So we had a few people that were doing this. So what happened? Why are we all able to attend this conference and get paid to write Ruby code on a daily basis? Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because I was actually, the project I was on was a defense research project, and we were using Ruby because it was basically under the radar and could work that way. Through 2005 or whatever, I was kind of working on the same project. I was working on one domain. What's fascinating is how many people have written more than 6 different Rails applications since Rails released. So what's really cool about this is you've been able to actually write across multiple domains, multiple business domains possibly. Now, I've been able to do about 30 Rails applications since Rails came out. Work across those things. Not myself, not by myself, but work across them. 30 different domains. That's very cool. One of the things that this framework, Rails, introduced is allowed me to actually focus not on technology, but more on business domains and understanding them and learning how to encode them in code. And the technology gets out of the way. I'm focused almost all the time these days on business domains. That is why we can actually be in this conference. That is why it's as large as it is. And that actually came out of this gentleman's work in trying to actually build for his business domain, extract out a generalized framework, Rails, and then actually release that out so other people could do that. So, I want to thank him for that. I think we all should thank him for that, and introduce David Hansson for our keynote today.
Thank you. Test. Morning. As Rich was saying, I've actually been working on Ruby with Ruby for 7 years, or a little more than that. And in the past 7 years, I've frequently been asked, why Ruby? Journalists or other programmers or myself have been asking, what is it about Ruby that makes it such an appealing programming language that since I actually learned Ruby back in 2003, I've not truly bothered to look at another programming language again. I have sinned against the learn one new programming language a year rule, but I've been doing that because I've been so content with Ruby. And I've sort of had a stock answer for a while, which is Ruby fits my brain like a glove, which is just sort of this weird sense of saying there's something magical about Ruby that just makes it wonderful to use. But I've come to realize that that's really a cop-out. That's too easy. That's not really telling anybody anything or teaching anybody anything about what is it that's special about Ruby that makes it such that we all want to be here and we all want to work with Ruby. So I've started to sort of examine that. I've started to examine some of the reasons, the specifics of what it is about the Ruby language and the Ruby community that makes it so special, and I want to share those findings with you today. That sounded very scientific, didn't it? It's not actually at all scientific, so don't get your hopes up. Now, why is that even interesting? Why do we care why we like Ruby? I think we should care because if we examine the things that we like in detail, we'll learn something that'll hopefully inform us in ways for picking new technology or for reasoning about why should we stick with Ruby tomorrow or in a year from now. Or if another programming language comes up, what is it about that could possibly challenge our use of Ruby or teach us something? So examining that will hopefully make us wiser about what it is that we do and why it is that we do it. And I think that that's incredibly important for understanding who you are and what it is that you do. Most of you guys here work with Ruby many, many hours every day. So having just a little bit of an understanding of what it is that you do for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, I think is a prudent thing to do. So let's go through some of the reasons why Ruby. The first thing that really attracted me to Ruby was features. So when I first saw Ruby, I saw a collection of really neat features. And of course, the poster child feature is blocks. Blocks is sort of the poster child for what makes Ruby special in the terms of features. There's tons of other features that are wonderful, and obviously it's not just the blocks, it's sort of the combination of everything, that Ruby doesn't just have one big idea and everything flows from that. Ruby is a collection of many great ideas, everything from the blogs to the first time I saw unless. Just the keyword unless to me was kind of a big revelation. Just shifting your thinking about how you write code, and wait a minute, it does this exactly the same thing as if not, but Matt's actually cared enough to flip that around and turn it into a keyword. That was sort of like, whoa, this is not just about functionality, yet it gets turned into a feature. Now, all of these features, blocks or unless or whatever it is that is your favorite feature about Ruby is all about this utilitarian stuff. It's all about this use the best tool for the job kind of thing. And, well, I started with that because I think in some ways it's the least important. The features of Ruby, or the specific just one feature, is not really what makes us stick around. It's not what causes somebody to not learn another programming language for 7 years. Because I think that the whole idea of best tool for the job is sort of a false notion. It has this pretext of being objective, that you could somehow, by looking at just a checklist of features or utilitarian use of a language, decide ultimately whether one language or another language is the right tool for the job, which I think is completely and utterly false. And I think it's a sort of a fake and naive evaluation of the tools that we use if we think we can boil it down just to the utilitarian functions. Now, moving up the ladder, Ruby is about a culture too. One of those cultures is testing. I found it pretty special when I arrived to Ruby in, 2003, that there was such a focus on testing. It was not like Ruby invented testing or unit testing or sort of modern testing like that, but there was a culture that really took it in and made it part of the community core, that this is what we do. We test software. There's not another way to also do it. No, no, no. If you're going to be in this crowd, you're going to test your software. Otherwise, you're not really in yet. That sort of renders the Ruby folks as a special tribe. There is this tribe who cares very deeply about testing, which is different from other tribes who might sort of have some testing in them or occasionally care about testing. We care about testing pretty much all the time. So that makes us kind of special. And I think what's interesting, too, is we can look at a lot of different things, like the guy with the shiny peacock hat. Maybe that's Cucumber. Like sort of a very ornate, intricate way of testing, and yet he can stand right next to the guy who just has some paint on his face. Maybe that's test unit. But it doesn't have to be that complicated. Maybe it's just that. Yet, we're all still in the same tribe, because it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether we use one testing form or another testing form. What makes Ruby special is that we care intensely about the testing. And we can get along even using these same tools because that's the driving fundamental. They care about testing, not the testing tools themselves. So that moves it sort of a little higher up the chain of arguments here. We have the functional arguments of this is this feature, that feature, this is the best tool for the job, that tool for the job. Now we're up into something that's moved beyond just the individual level of care concern into more of a shared function. That the whole thing about testing is not just that I test, it's that other people test too. So if I use their software and if I want to make a patch to it, I can run their tests and I can find out that I didn't break something. That eases collaboration, sort of smoothes out all those little bumps there would otherwise be in open source collaboration. Just like we've had other things like GitHub, it smoothes out how easy it is to collaborate. And I think that spirit of collaboration is at a very high level in Ruby. Because of things like the culture of testing, because of things like GitHub, because of all these other things that we do that we consciously care about to make it easier to collaborate. And this is why I think it's important to look at these whys. Why Ruby? Why is it that such a relatively small community is capable of putting out so many interesting things, working on so much interesting code, being at the forefront of so many interesting drives in the software community? Okay. Third reason. This is a little hard to see this code, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is when I look at this piece of code, there's something to it. I think that this is just a beautiful piece of code. It doesn't do anything complex. It's not beautiful in sort of a grand revelation of an intricate algorithm sort of way. But there's something about the details of the presentation that uniquely appeals to me. There's something about the aesthetic of how Ruby lays out on the screen that is intensely joyful. And I've tried to sort of deduce what is it exactly. And the best thing I can sort of arrive at is when I look at code that's written that does the same thing as this, but where the spacing is a little off. Somebody uses 3 or there's parentheses around the first symbol of authenticate. It doesn't look right. Like there's somehow that aesthetic is so refined that the addition or the removal of just a set of parentheses can change how I feel about the code. Now, what I find interesting is that this is sort of roughly how I started writing Ruby code a long time ago. The code style hasn't changed a whole lot. And what's equally interesting is when I look at most other Ruby code, it looks pretty similar to something like this. The coding style in Ruby is very homogeneous. We care roughly all about making code look pretty much the same. Much more so than I find in many other programming communities. The sense of shared aesthetic is really strong. And I think it's really strong because there's just something about laying out Ruby code that has a sort of an inherent set of relations between how the elements look together that just feels good. It's sort of like looking at something simple like the pyramids. Oh, well, that's a pretty simple form. There's something appealing about that form. What is it about it? It's triangle. It's hard to describe it. What you can describe it with, though, is not so much about talking about what it is as what it's not. When I look at this piece of code, which is Python, I don't get that warm, fuzzy feeling. There's something just off. And we can even break it down. If you start from just the command line, the fact that they would need to repeat the goose eyes 3 times, that seems a little excessive, doesn't it? How about, wouldn't 2 have done it? What about 1 if it started right after class? The fact that there's a space even after the last one, that doesn't quite feel right either. And that's not even getting into the meat of it. The meat of it being def init with double underscores on each side, and this is something I have to write all the time. Self being passed around all the time, yuck. the named parameters, especially on the second line, being uppercase like that, with the equal sign jammed up right from the key to the value, it doesn't feel right. And I think it's the same reaction that a lot of other Ruby programmers have when they look at something like a piece of Python code. There's something off about it. That doesn't mean this can't be beautiful to other people. I'm sure it is, I hope. But it's not beautiful to us. And that's, I think, part of what makes that the Ruby community so homogeneous, is that we appreciate the same kind of beauty. OK. Moving even further up in the list of reasons. I remember the first time I read this quote. I think I had not even truly started working with Ruby yet, and I read that the designer of the language says that Ruby is designed to make programmers happy. That, to me, was a real shock, that somebody designing a language could care about something so non-functional, so non-objective as the happiness of the programmer using it, that it was a complete shift in my mind. It completely changed my perception of what programming languages are and why I do the things that I do. So all of these reasons sort of, I think, line up as one of those pyramids. And as I was thinking about this, it reminded me about something called the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Maslow is this psychologist who in the 1940s was trying to deduce the motivation, the elements of motivation of mankind. Like, what are the things that motivates us and when do we try to go for it? And he built it up into these three levels. At the lowest fundamental level, you have physiological needs, which are things like food, water, sex. One step above, you have security, that you're not being hunted by tigers or something else like that. Third level, social, you belong to some sort of tribe. There are other people around you. Fourth level, esteem, that within that tribe, there's something you do to better yourself in the eyes of your peers. And then finally, self-actualization, that you're doing things, you're working on things for you, for the betterment of you to be the best you that you can be. Now, that reminded me about the reasons we just went through. We didn't address the sort of physiological levels, which to me is sort of somewhat protection from pointer arithmetic, that you don't have to deal with that, luckily. We don't even think about that anymore. That is from a past era, and luckily, it is not our problem anymore. Now, security, I think, is roughly, vaguely, kind of not really perhaps, equated to the powerful features that we get from Ruby, sort of the lowest level, that we're protected from writing these reams of long code because we have features who can do in one line what it takes Java programmers 25. The social need that we belong to some circle, a culture of testing, that we all care about this testing and that is sort of part of what binds us together. Esteem, that we want to write beautiful code in the eyes of ourselves and in the eyes of others. And finally, self-actualization, that we're doing all of this not just to create programs, but to be happy for 8-10 hours a day when we do the work that it is that we do. Now, that fits in pretty neatly. Now, I tried to then fit it in sort of how I felt certain programming languages applied to this level here. At the lowest level, basic protects you from dealing with pointers. Yes, yes. PHP has some surprisingly powerful features in a single namespace all lumped together. And Python does have some community. They do share some values, some of them. And sort of beautiful code, you can certainly write beautiful code in Smalltalk, but none of these languages, for me, again, this is somewhat, or not somewhat, hopefully non-objective, subjective, my idea of things. Ruby is the only language that sort of steps above all of that and reaches the pinnacle of self-actualizations through its focus on happiness. And finally, yeah, it couldn't fit in assembler anyway. I don't think it even gives you fulfillment of physiological needs. There's no protection from anything here. Okay. So we have sort of all these reasons for why Ruby is such a magical thing, and we can try to map it to a framework like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we can see that all these things add up in such a way that we're reaching the pinnacle of the pyramid, and that's great. I was like, is that really the whole explanation? Is that truly why I love Ruby and no other? No, it doesn't fulfill the whole picture. It fulfills a lot of it, and I think it's a very important cornerstone of it. But I think that there's an even more fundamental divide between Ruby and most other programming languages that I've had the pleasure or displeasure of dealing with in the past, which is freedom. Ruby and the Ruby community has a unique focus on freedom. Let's go through a few of them. To me, it started even just reading the licensing. The MIT license, to me, is just a wonderful declaration of freedom. It is very short, and it basically tells you that you could do whatever the fuck you want as long as you don't sue me. That's beautiful. You get the permission to deal in the software without restriction, without limitation, to copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, and or sell copies of the software. That almost sounds like some founding father piece of document. And it's inspiring because it's short and I actually bothered to read it. Compare that to the GPL. I actually had to bump down to font size 3 to fit 80% of that license on one slide. Freedom is that complex? Really? It needs 15, I think, different paragraphs of describing how we're protecting this freedom somehow? I don't think so. Now, that's sort of a pretty fundamental freedom. You can do whatever hell you want with Ruby or just about any other piece of Ruby software put out there. You can put it into a commercial context. You can remix it. You can redo it. And you can live and let live. I don't care. You can go forth, and I won't come back to bother you. I won't come back to haunt you for unwilling patches for you to submit back to the master. Because I thought you developed somehow on my software. I think that is a much closer definition of what my interpretation of freedom is rather than Richard Stallman's. So that's sort of a noble freedom, the freedom of licensing and the freedom of doing whatever you want. What I also think is wonderful is that we can have these sort of aspirational, fundamental freedoms, and in the same community, we can combine them with these weird freedoms, these freedoms that aren't professional, that doesn't fit into sort of the notion of the software engineer or the founding fathers or any other sort of high-reaching ideal. That the Ruby community can come around and look at a cartoon that is not only weird but downright bizarre at times and think that that is probably some of the coolest stuff that's come out of this community. Is just awesome. It is not that other communities are not capable of producing weird, bizarre stuff, because truly they are. It's the fact that we as an entire community came together and recognized that these weird things were not only cool, they were absolutely central to who we are. And by coming together and recognizing this, we sort of lifted up the founder of this weirdness, why, to become a hero. And I think it's really important when you look and you try to judge a community on who they are they holding up as heroes? Who are the sort of magical people in the community? And to me, one of the most magical people is certainly Y. And he is absolutely a big part of what is still pleasurable about being in Ruby. Because even though he's not here, at least in person anymore, he's certainly here in spirit. And many others are carrying on from sort of his lead. I was just seeing something that Greg Pollack put up, a new Rails tutorial that was mixing it in with zombies. And I was thinking, using zombies to teach Rails? That was probably not going to happen at a Microsoft convention. Like, there's something about that weirdness that doesn't fit into the professional notion, which is precisely why it's worth cherishing and why it's worth caring about. I remember we had a marching band a few years ago at RubyConf, or RailsConf. And I remember a couple of the people who saw that usually were first-timers, and their reaction would be like, ugh, what's going on? The weirdness somehow attacked their brain, and they were like trying to process this and couldn't quite figure out how they were supposed to feel about a marching band at a programmer conference. How does that make sense? It doesn't. That's why it's wonderful. And I think anybody who then came back the next year came back with a much deeper appreciation of why we like to be weird. Now, this sort of weirdness is a pretty large spectrum. Like, you can make jokes about junky bacon, and you can have scantily clad ladies on trombones, and that's all good, and it fits within the world. But at the same time, it does have some limits. Like, weird angry, that didn't work. So, off to the side with that. There is some boundaries to the freedom. You can't yell fire in a theater, and you can't just be weird angry. Okay. Now, this is all leading up to what I think, if I had to pick just one thing, just one freedom in the entire Ruby community, the language of Ruby, the sort of essence of what Ruby is to me and why I still care so deeply about the programming language 7 years later, it's this guy. Monkey patching. Monkey patching, to me, is what continues to make Ruby so fun for me. Why it doesn't run out of room. Why you can never learn everything there is to learn about Ruby, because Ruby is this living organism that we continuously extend. It is why, in some ways, even though I love the work that's going on 1.9, I haven't been following it that closely because I already have Ruby 7.5. I've been working on Ruby for the past 7 years and adding something to it all the time. Now, a few of these things. One of the first things we added, which I think falls under all the definitions of even weird and off and like you're not supposed to do this, was sort of the idea of pluralization in Rails. This was, at the time it was introduced, a highly controversial subject. The fact that you would automatically try to turn sort of English words like person into people when you were doing the mapping between the database and so on. It was highly controversial at the time. Today, I'm just looking back at it and seeing that's absolutely wonderful. Not only is it wonderful, it's wonderful that somebody took the time to figure out that the pluralized form of octopus is octopi. Just in case somebody had a model with octopus, they could now rest assured that their database table would automatically be octopi. No configuration needed. This is adding on to just string. This is just adding a bunch of methods onto string, and it's a relatively sort of harmless endeavor, at least now. At the time, of course, highly controversial. Sort of a second example here, which is pretty hard to read, is the extensions that we've added to array. Sort of just different ways of slicing array, which are all present already. We are wrapping up. We are caring enough to I shouldn't say we, because this was also slightly controversial at this time. I cared enough to add a method for second on array, such that I could just write out second instead of square brackets 1 when I try to access the second element in an array. Like, it doesn't do anything. I can't do more with Ruby now that array has second. I'm not going to wake up in the morning and imagining programs that I can now write because array has second. It is these slight refinements on the language that just makes it intensely enjoyable for me to continue writing it. And even though, to this day, I think I have used second as sort of a thing in a program a total of 5 or 6 times, I get a huge smile whenever I read that code again. And we can even add weird things like array 42. You cannot read the comment here, but it says equal to self square bracket 41, also known as accessing the Reddit. This sort of came out of a thread on Reddit where somebody was complaining so loudly of why we would care to add second and third and fourth to array. This is redundant. There's already a mathematical approach to doing the same thing. It doesn't make sense to them. It was weird. Like, why would somebody care about this level of aesthetic? And just to spite them, I added 42. Because it made even less sense than second and third, and I think it's even more important, especially because I've used it exactly 0 times. I don't think anybody in here has a program. Actually, raise your hand if you have a program that actually uses 42 on array. Perfect. Nobody. This is just here to prove a point. And proving that point and embedding it into something that actually goes into Ruby, that looks like absolute madness to somebody who's treating programming languages as those are just functional tools and we're looking for the best tool for the job. Nobody's going to look at a checklist of features and say, oh, I'm going to use Ruby because it has array 42. That doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't do that. And I find that that's just a great way, just like the marching band at RailsConf, of shocking people into sort of making their brain see things differently. This is a great sort of shock factor like that. Okay, so we can make extensions to string or array that are sort of just different ways of slicing it or coming up with some patterns, or we can introduce entirely new concepts such as object blank and object present, which is just a way of wrapping up sort of a common approach to certain things and making it a little nicer. But making it a little nicer to the point where this actually gets bubbled up to be sort of a first-level language construct. Like, we now talk about, hey, is this value blank? Like, it's a concept that fits into the whole thing just like it was any other part of Ruby. The freedom that comes from monkey patching is the fact that our contributions, my contributions, anybody who's contributed to active support or any other monkey patch to either an existing framework or to the language itself is on an even playing field. There is not 2 kinds of people. There is not perfect ivory tower language designer who always knows best and will come up with everything that everybody needs at all time, and then the peons. There are people just working on Ruby. Different dialects of Ruby. We don't all have to agree that 42 is such a wonderful thing. It's fine. Like, we don't have the same sense of humor, and we don't appreciate the same things, but we appreciate that we can work on different dialects, and we can still get along. We don't talk exactly the same version of Ruby, but it doesn't matter. It's roughly the same version, and you can get to talk the same version very easily. Now, this whole idea of monkey patching, this whole idea of extending the freedom of language design to sort of the common man or the unwashed masses of programmers is very, very scary to a lot of people. One of those people is Jeff Atwood of Coding Horror and Stack Overflow. I found this wonderful quote from him. If the idea of monkey patching scares you a little, it probably should. Ooh. Can you imagine debugging code where the string class had subtly different behaviors from the string you've learned to use? Oh, that sounds scary. What if somebody just changed string underneath me? What if 2S just shut out fireworks? What would happen then to the world? Can you imagine? Yes, I can imagine. And when I imagine, it's usually wonderful things like unicorn code and 42s and blanks and all these other awesome things that I think we've added to the Ruby language one method at the time. These, to me, are all the true unicorns of language design. Now, not all people have this cheery outlook on the world. Not everybody expects the best of people or try to set high expectations and relish in the fact when people live up to them. Some people have a much more dark outlook on the world, of what programmers would do if we gave them freedom. They can't handle freedom. Freedom is scary. When people are free to do whatever it is that they want to do, well, what will happen? They'll probably pick up an AK-47 and shoot me. That the freedom to do things like adding 42 is just on the same playing field as changing string in weird ways that will make my program shoot out fireworks at inappropriate times. This notion that if we give programmers freedom, if we give each other freedom, that that's what's going to happen, that that's going to be the main scenario, that we can't give people freedom because what if they abuse it? Just like I've grown really tired of the best tool for the job, I've also grown really tired of just enough rope to hang himself. Give me a fucking break. Just enough rope? Does that mean we should outlaw rope? You shouldn't be allowed to have rope because what if you hung yourself? Is that the main use case for rope? I don't think so. Which is why, at a reasonable time, people didn't outlaw rope, because you can do a lot of things with rope. One of them is hanging yourself, and that is not so good, and you shouldn't do that. Just like you shouldn't really change string to shoot out fireworks in other people's programs. That's not a nice thing to do. People probably wouldn't want to be friends with you or follow you on GitHub if you did. So why are we so afraid that this might happen? That if we give people the freedom to evolve their programming language into unpure dialects, that they'll all become terrorists and terrorize my programs? I don't know. But I do know that this is not just a harmless sort of play on your imagination. Do you imagine unicorns? Or do you imagine terrorists? It's not like it's just a mind play that's sort of a theoretical thing. No, no, no. People turn this division of thinking into real, actionable things. In the real world, some of that is called security theater. The fact that we now have to take off our shoes at airports because some guy tried to put in some explosive gum in one of his shoes is absolutely moronic. And it's moronic not only because it doesn't work, it's also moronic because we're taking sort of the one use case of shoes, which is carrier for explosive, and thinking that that's a reasonable use case that we should prevent everybody from doing because everybody's probably carrying explosives in their shoes. If we allowed them to keep on their shoes, they would all shove an explosive in their shoes, and we wouldn't be able to catch them. No, that wouldn't happen. But yet, here it is, and we take off our shoes, and we play along with this security theater. And some people leave it to, oh, that's a good thing. If it just prevents one guy from shoving an explosive in his shoes, then we should all take off our shoes. Which is actually, when I came up with this, the harmless thing was taking off your shoes. Now, some guy shoved explosives into his underwear. And now we all have to get our balls fondled when we go to the airport. The programming equivalent of having your balls fondled when you go to the airport is type safety. Somebody somewhere thought that, hey, what if somebody assigns an object to a variable that is not the object you thought it was going to be? What if they just shoved explosives in there and it didn't have an explosive class? How would you know that it was explosives in that variable and not a deck of cards? We better protect against this. We better make everybody write out exactly what type they're putting in their variables, just so that nobody does any funny business. And thus, millions of programmers for more than a decade have been forced to having their programming balls fondled by Java almost every single time they just want to declare a goddamn variable. Now, that is not proportional force. That is not being smart about what the problem is. Because if you think back, when was the last time your program crashed because of a type error? When did you last call a method on something you thought was a deck of cards and it turned out to be explosives? Raise your hand. Last time you had a typing error? 1? 2? Okay, out of 500 people, about 2 people can vaguely remember that they once had a typing error. Is that enough justification to make everybody write out their types all the time and all the bullshit that goes with that? Fuck no. It's not proportional. It's not good police work. It's just enforcing arbitrary rules in case that somebody somewhere might not be stupid enough to do something really stupid. Now, if we think of every single program we write as sort of just stupid waiting to happen, we're going to end up with programming languages that treats everybody like they're stupid. Again, Java, one example, treating everybody like they're stupid. But I think it's even more fundamental than just having a really sad view of the world of programmers and thinking that all programmers are stupid. It's sort of more, it's deeper than that. As Jeff was saying, there's fear in the air. These freedoms, what might they lead to? This is terrible. We should stop that. And for probably the one time in my life, I actually agreed with George W. Bush on something.
They hate our freedoms. 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 They hate our freedoms.
That's what's going on.
They hate our freedoms.
They really hate our freedoms.
They hate our freedoms.
And they've sort of gone on with this smear campaign against our freedoms, calling it monkey patching. Sounds pretty scary, right? The only image I could find of a monkey on a patch was a pretty evil-looking monkey. There's some pretty sharp big teeth there and a pointy hand. Well, one theory was that we could just rebrand monkey patching into freedom patching. I think that one has legs. Now, this idea of being scared of freedom and what to do with that is very interesting. Larry Wall, in a wonderful essay on modern and postmodern programming languages, wrote this: "The very fact that it is possible to write messy programs in Perl is also what makes it possible to write programs that are cleaner in Perl than they could be in a language that attempts to enforce cleanliness. The potential for greater good goes right along with the potential for greater evil." He's talking about just messy programs versus unmessy programs, sort of the aesthetic of programming. I think it goes even deeper than that. I think the key here is that the potential for greater good goes right along with the potential for greater evil. The fact that Ruby allows us to hang ourselves and shove explosives into our underwears or shoes or wherever it fits is the same thing that makes it possible to write these gloriously beautiful programs. And the fact that people stick around once they arrive at Ruby. I've not met a whole lot of programmers who said, "Yeah, I used to do Ruby. I'm back to Java now. All these explosives anywhere was just getting too much to me." It doesn't really happen. That progression is not a major trend anywhere. Now, this is very easy for us just to look at as sort of like a programming approach to things, but I think it goes even deeper than that. I think the fact is that Ruby is a friend. It is not your parents. Ruby is not telling you what you can and cannot do. It's encouraging you to sort of, hey, you should have a look at this, but not too much, or do what you want. You'll find out for yourself that that's not a good idea. And I think that that sort of core mentality extends to many other facts of life. Trying to mandate what other people should or should not do with their programming languages or their bodies or anything else is a flawed idea. Ruby is your friend, and it's saying, hey, dude, if you want to get high, there's a good chance you'll have a good time. But, dude, if you're getting high every single day, maybe you should look at something here. But, dude, it's up to you. I am not going to tell you that you cannot monkey patch every single class in the Ruby standard library. It's up to you to find that out. And you will find that out. And then you will learn, that was probably not a good idea. The time where I changed string to shoot out fireworks was fun that one time, but it probably wasn't a long-term winning career move. So I'll stop doing that. Now, that realization is much, much deeper than some asshole just telling you that you can't smoke pot. That doesn't teach anybody anything. You can't do it because it's bad for you. I said so. Some lobbyist 80 years ago thought it was a good idea. Psh. Well, sort of easy enough when you talk about pot. Like half the population of California is already in favor of legalization. I think it extends much deeper than that, and it has to. The things that you can do sometimes are downright dangerous. Coke is definitely sort of a harder drug than pot, and the consequences if you choose to indulge can be much worse. Just like we have different parts of extending Ruby, some are harmless, just like adding a second method to something. Some are much worse, like overriding existing behavior. You should use each in appropriate moderation. But the fact is that sort of the scare tactics, the scare campaigns, that if you smoke pot once, you're going to be a pothead and a crackhead and live on the street and blow people for $5. that progression is not very helpful. It's not teaching people something because they smoke pot once and like, shit, who do I have to blow now? Doesn't happen. And then they're like, hey, You told me I would end up blowing people for $5 if I smoked pot. That didn't happen. What's all this other bullshit you're telling me? Coke looks fun. That might actually lead you down to the path of blowing people for $5. But that doesn't mean it should be illegal. The fact is that on sort of the scale of guidance versus enforcement, Ruby chooses guidance. Java chooses enforcement. And there's a long human history of sort of which is the right one to be at. So cigarettes are pretty bad for you. They kill millions of people, and your lung turns all black, and you will probably die if you smoke, like all people do eventually, but maybe a little sooner. In any case, it is bad for you. So cigarettes have been legal for a long time. Nobody's talking about outright banning the right to personally smoke. What we do instead is the sensible thing. We inform people, we give them the information to make informed choices about whether that risk is worth it to you or not worth it to you. On cigarette packs, it now says smoking might lead to cancer or black teeth or black lungs or something else. The information is out there. There's plenty of studies saying if you smoke, you cut off 7 years of your expected life expectancy or something like that, and yet people still choose to smoke. That's okay. That is exactly how it's supposed to be. The fact that something is dangerous, we give you the information, monkey patching or freedom patching can be dangerous. And you should know what the dangers are, and if you choose to accept those dangers, it is none of my goddamn business. So smoke's one example. I think an even worse example is food. Food and bad food certainly kills way more people than smoking pot or cocaine. And yet we've been very slow to sort of pick up the enforcement versus guidance. And nobody's even thinking about outlawing the triple Whopper cheeseburger with extra sauce that's 2,000 calories, even though that's probably worse for you long term and more likely to kill you than smoking pot on weekends. Now, the enlightening part here is that we've actually started to do something. So in New York, for example, they're now listing the calorie count on, this is some sandwich bar somewhere, the calorie count on their menu boards. You have to do that. You have to give the information to people and tell them how dangerous something is for you. And if you can see that the Chipotle chicken on toasted French with bacon, sounds like pretty innocent sandwich, right? It's 990 calories. I didn't know that, and I stopped eating there because of that. The system worked. And the system worked much better if somebody had just said, do you know what? These Chipotle chickens, way too fucking dangerous for you. You're just going to eat oatmeal for now, and you're going to love it. No. We're humans, and we don't like to be told what to do. There's very predictive consequences, of what happens when you try to tell people what to do and they don't want to do it. They don't just stop doing it. No, no, no. We are way too clever for that. We invent black markets. So when the US tried Prohibition in the 20s, did the country go dry? Of course it didn't. A whole wonderful industry for Al Capone and his friends developed to supply liquor to people who still wanted liquor. Very predictable. Exact same thing is happening with pot or cocaine or anything else that people still want to do that somebody's telling them they cannot do. Now, this happens in programming too. When a language like Java is telling you you cannot do certain things that you really kind of want to do, you will come up with elaborate, complex schemes to still do what it is that you want to do. These schemes are much, much worse for you than the original infraction. no good. This leads me to the fact that Ruby is a programming language for consenting adults. Ruby is not governed by your parents telling you to eat your vegetables or you won't get any dessert. You can goddamn just eat that dessert if you want it. Still a good idea to eat your vegetables, but if you choose to, you can do what you want. And I think as sort of a class representation of what happens when you design a programming language for consenting adults instead of thinking of them as misbehaving children, you get very good results. You do not get a community of programmers who just do stupid things all the fucking time just because they can. In fact, you get a community of programmers who do really thoughtful, well-considered things because they can. It is two sides of the same thing. The possibility for greater evil goes right along with the possibility for greater good. Now, you don't have to condone all those individual choices. If somebody chooses to go to Vegas and gamble away their house at a casino, that is a sad story. It doesn't mean that gambling should be illegal. Just like if somebody overrides string and they choose to do something stupid, it doesn't mean that monkey patching should be illegal. The fact that people have the power to do stupid shit that you don't agree with, it's not a reason to tell them that they can't. Because A, it doesn't work, and B, you probably do not have the context. This is why I love the whole monkey patching thing so much. Because Ruby was designed as a general-purpose programming language that can write all sorts of programs. Matt, as ever brilliant and smart as he is, cannot imagine all the uses of Ruby. He cannot design for every single niche or business context or whatever. That has to come from sort of the specifics of it, which is exactly what we did in Rails. We came up with our own dialect of Ruby that was slightly more targeted to writing web applications, and things were good. So just because you sort of have some abstract moral objection to whether it's gambling or prostitution or anything else, keep it to yourself as a sort of enforcement issue. You can advise people that it is unwise to gamble your house away in Vegas or blow the state's budget on hookers. But the fact remains is that if I have to choose between guidance and enforcement, I prefer liberty with danger to peace with slavery. Some smart guy said this once. Another smart guy said this once.
And I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny. You've come to fight as free men. And free men you are. What will you do with that freedom? Will you fight?
Fight against that? No! We will run!
And we will live. Aye. Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Thank you very much.